Hey, church family, I wanted to take this opportunity to present you with another word of encouragement as we continue to pray for the outcome of this election. Now, despite the fact that we actually do find some evidence of computer glitches, uncounted votes, as well as postmortem voters, the headlines that are put forth by the mainstream media, well, they continue to assure us that there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud. For example, a Vox headline recently assures us that election officials find no evidence of widespread voter fraud. A recent CNN headline informs us that election officials contradict Trump's voter fraud conspiracy theories. And the New York Times recently ran this headline: "The Times called officials in every state, no evidence of voter fraud." In other words, the mainstream media wants us to feel confident in what they're saying, that all of the election officials have already confirmed that there's no evidence of voter fraud. But now let's think about this for a moment. If there are election officials who are guilty of allowing voter fraud, well, why would they confess this to the press? If there are actually election officials who have engaged in voter fraud, they're not going to simply just tell the media that they've done this. Now, don't get me wrong, because I'm not making accusations against any of the election officials. No, instead, I only mean to point out that the mainstream media actually employs reporters and correspondents who have proven to be easily deceived. One example of this was seen back in September 5th of 2018. This is when the New York Times published an op-ed piece which was highly critical of President Trump. And while they claimed that their anonymous source was a senior official working for the president, the article was actually written by a low-level staffer named Miles Taylor, who was to some degree far removed from the White House staff. What this means is that the New York Times was either lying about the author of that article, or they themselves had been deceived into believing that their anonymous source had more access to the president than he actually had. I'm going to guess the latter. I'm going to guess that they were just deceived by this anonymous author. Listen, the author, Miles Taylor, not only deceived the editors there at the New York Times, but he also deceived the talking heads there at CNN. As a matter of fact, it was last August when CNN's Anderson Cooper interviewed that author, Miles Taylor, and he asked Taylor point blank if he was in fact the anonymous source that wrote the New York Times article. Taylor responded to Anderson Cooper by declaring, "I wear a mask for two things, Halloween and pandemics, so no." So he told Anderson Cooper point blank, "I am not that anonymous author." But then it was last October when Taylor went on to confess that he is in fact the anonymous author that wrote the New York Times article. At that point in time, CNN's Chris Cuomo challenged Taylor by declaring this. He says, "You lied to us, Miles. You were asked in August if you were anonymous here on CNN with Anderson Cooper, and you said no. Now, why should CNN keep you on the payroll after lying like that?" Great question. That's such a good question. Why would CNN continue employing this person who admittedly deceived one of their senior correspondents? And yet the fact is, they still do. Now, this is just one example of the way in which the mainstream media has been duped by those who claim to have breaking news. Another example of this was seen last January when most major media outlets allowed Jussie Smollett to spread his lies about the white men with MAGA hats who attacked him and put a noose around his neck. And as it turns out, his story was completely fabricated, and yet the mainstream media was quick to report his lies. It was also last January when CNN ended up settling a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit, which was filed by Nick Sandmann, the high school student who was betrayed by the mainstream media as a racist kid who was guilty of instigating a confrontation with a Native American elder. And the full footage of that incident, the full video footage went on to prove that the student was not the instigator. And so once again, we can see how the mainstream media was either deceived or they were simply guilty of being deceptive. You might not know this, but there are actually many pranksters who have successfully duped the mainstream media on many, many occasions. For example, there's Pruer and Pickett, there's the Juke Squad, the Yes Men, Joe Skaggs, and many others who have actually been featured on the news after the media failed to properly vet the details of their fake stories. And who can forget about the Balloon Boy hoax that occurred back in 2009? Now, as we consider how easy it is to fool those who are in charge of the mainstream media, you'll just have to excuse me for struggling to believe them when they assure us that election officials have found no evidence of widespread voter fraud. I mean, are we talking about the same election officials that closed down counting at 3 a.m. only to then produce a massive spike in Biden votes by 4 a.m.? Are we talking about those election officials? Listen, rather than listening to the mainstream media, which has an extremely poor track record of telling the truth, let's wait. Let's wait for the evidence to be presented in a court of law. Let's wait for the evidence to be examined before we insist that there's no widespread voter fraud. There may be, there may not be. I just say let's wait for the evidence. And if the evidence is proven to be false, then we can agree that there was no fraud. And on the other hand, though, if there is real evidence of voter fraud, then we can rejoice in the fact that the scam and the steal was exposed. Either way, we need to do our best to avoid aligning our lives with those who are spreading rumors and lies. This reminds me of something that King David wrote. It's in the 26th Psalm, where David declared, "Do not gather my soul with sinners, nor my life with bloodthirsty men, in whose hands is a sinister scheme, and whose right hand is full of bribes. But as for me, I will walk in my integrity, redeem me, and be merciful to me." Christian, listen, we are to walk in the integrity of truth. And we do this as we walk by faith with Jesus Christ. And with this as the goal, let's continue to pray for the outcome of this election. Let's pray, if there is no voter fraud, that would be brought to light. And if there is voter fraud, that would be exposed. Let's pray that the Lord will simply raise up the right leaders according to his perfect plan. And as always, I encourage every Christian, let's continue fighting the good fight of faith, all for the glory of God.